My husband texted from Maui at 11:43 at night. Just married your business partner. You are pathetic, by the way. I looked at the photo of lace, champagne, and smug smiles, then replied with one word: beautiful. I opened my laptop and started pressing keys they never knew existed for the last 7 months. They thought I was the left-behind wife. They did not realize they had just finalized a fraud dossier complete down to the exact second. My name is Scarlett Ross. I am 41 years old, and I rebuild things that have been destroyed. That is not a metaphor. I am the founder and chief executive officer of Palisade Renewal Group. We are a specialized disaster recovery coordination firm operating across the American South. When a Category 4 hurricane rips the roof off a county high school, when a sudden flood guts a rural hospital network, or when a localized electrical fire turns a municipal courthouse into a blackened, toxic shell, my company gets the call. We do not just clean up, we bring in the specialized contractors. We source the impossible construction materials during regional shortages. We handle the extreme friction of commercial insurance claims, and we make the ash, the mud, and the ruin go away. I did not inherit this empire, nor did I walk into it with a pristine degree from an Ivy League business school. I built Palisade from nothing but a rusted-out Ford pickup truck and sheer, unadulterated willpower. In the beginning, there were only a few minor municipal contracts. I survived my first active hurricane season by sleeping on a rigid, imitation leather office chair, eating cold soup from a tin can, and refusing to take the word no from overloaded supply chain vendors. My blood, my sweat, and my absolute dedication are mixed into the drywall dust and the poured concrete of half the public buildings on the Gulf Coast. I am a woman who understands structural integrity, both in architecture and in business. Nolan Weller, the man currently drinking champagne in Hawaii on my dime, is my husband. He is undeniably handsome, possessing that specific brand of effortless golden retriever charm that makes people instantly lower their defenses. Before we met, he made short, emotive brand films for boutique advertising agencies. A few years into our marriage, when Palisade began to scale rapidly, I brought him in-house to manage our media presence and public image. It seemed like a logical, seamless synergy at the time. I was the gritty operator. He was the Polish. He smoothed out my rough edges for the public. He made our disaster recovery efforts look noble, cinematic, cleanly edited, and heroic. He made me feel like I was not just a machine built for working, but a woman who could still be softened. And then there is Delaney Cross. Delaney is my business partner. More accurately, she is the woman I personally elevated to that status. She is brilliant, mathematically ruthless, and sharp as shattered glass. I pulled her into Palisade 3 years ago, specifically because I needed a mind exactly like hers to handle our aggressive operational expansion and to navigate the labyrinthine nightmare of government bidding dossiers. Delaney speaks the cold, calculating language of profit margins, legal compliance, and investor relations that I never had the patience to master. I trusted her implicitly. She was supposed to be the architect of our next decade, my absolute right hand in the boardroom. Now, they are together. The text message from Maui was not merely a drunken mistake or a sudden, tearful confession born of overwhelming guilt. It was a calculated, vicious strike. The message contained that single, pathetic insult, but it was the attached photograph that was designed to do the real damage. The image showed the two of them standing on the expansive, polished stone patio of a high-end island resort. The dark, endless expanse of the Pacific Ocean stretched out behind them under the moonlight. They wore matching floral leis, the thick tropical blooms bright against their resort wear. Nolan held a crystal flute of champagne, his posture relaxed and triumphant. Delaney was leaning into his chest, offering the camera a smug, victorious, utterly satisfied smile. They looked exactly like a couple who believed they had just won a war cleanly and romantically. They were posing as the heroes of their own twisted movie, leaving the villain completely vanquished in their wake. They wanted me to feel the devastating humiliation of being the discarded wife. They expected the oblivious, workaholic woman to finally break, tossed aside for a sleeker, younger, more ruthless model. I did not cry. I did not scream. I did not hurl my mobile phone against the marble kitchen island, nor did I collapse onto the hardwood floor in a puddle of shattered dignity. I sat perfectly still in the dim, quiet light of my home office. I picked up my ceramic mug and took a slow, deliberate sip of room-temperature coffee. I looked at the photograph again. I did not look at it with a broken heart. I looked at it with the clinical eye of a disaster assessor evaluating structural damage. I analyzed the ambient lighting, the expensive background details of the resort, the sheer, blinding arrogance radiating from their postures. Then, with absolute precision, I pressed the side buttons on my phone to capture a high-resolution screenshot. I set the phone down. I opened the secure cloud drive on my heavy workstation laptop, navigated through a labyrinth of encrypted, nested directories, and dragged the image file into a specific, isolated folder. This folder was not new. I had not created it tonight in a fit of reactive rage. It had existed for months. It was quietly titled North Exit. Anyone observing me in this moment might find my composure unnatural, perhaps even terrifying. A woman who discovers her husband has eloped with her most trusted executive should be breaking glass, tearing at her hair, and screaming into the dead of night. But my tears had dried up entirely long before this high-definition photograph ever arrived. The truth is, I was no longer surprised by the affair. The betrayal of the flesh, the whispered hallway conversations that stopped when I approached, the stolen afternoons masked as site visits, the subtle shifts in their body language when they thought I was looking at spreadsheets. I had processed all of that in silent, solitary agony over the past seasons. I had already mourned the death of my marriage and the illusion of my friendship. No, what commanded my absolute, razor-sharp attention right now was not the fact that they were sleeping together. It was the precise timestamp of the message. He sent it at exactly 11:43 at night, Eastern Standard Time. I ran the mental calculation instantly. That made it roughly 5:43 in the evening in Maui. A highly specific, deliberate time to send a declaration of total war back to Atlanta. They were not just drunk on champagne and island hubris. I know Delaney Cross better than I know my own reflection. Delaney does not do anything impulsively. She does not let emotion dictate action without a secondary objective. She is a creature of strategy, timing, and corporate leverage. If they were sending me the ultimate, most humiliating provocation right now, late on a quiet night, it was not merely to break my heart for the thrill of it. It was a tactical launch. They were trying to trigger a massive emotional explosion. They wanted me erratic. They wanted me furious, devastated, distracted, and drowning in a paralyzing wave of personal grief. Why? Because I understood in my bones that they were preparing to launch the next, far more dangerous phase of their operation right under my nose, banking on the fact that I would be too blinded by tears to see it coming. They thought this text message was the dramatic conclusion of our story. They thought they had delivered the final blow. They did not understand that for me, the sight of that photograph and the timing of that insult was merely the starter pistol. They thought they were walking away clean. They did not realize they had just finalized a perfectly documented fraud dossier, complete down to the exact second. Atlanta is a city built on relentless hustle and suffocating summer heat. When I started 13 years ago, Palisade was nothing more than a leased, poorly ventilated warehouse just off Interstate 285. I was a young woman in steel-toed boots and cheap denim, holding a clipboard, trying to organize sheer chaos. Back then, my entire operation consisted of me and 3 exhausted dispatchers. We spent our days screaming over the noise of idling diesel engines, desperately connecting flatbed trucks of plywood, commercial dehumidifiers, and independent contractors with county commissioners who were panicking over flooded middle schools and gutted community centers. I learned early on that in the disaster recovery business, empathy is a luxury. Ruthless efficiency is what actually saves infrastructure. Over 13 grinding years, Palisade evolved into the gold standard. When a private hospital network in South Carolina lost its entire first floor to a storm surge, or when a massive property insurance syndicate needed an immediate, indisputable damage assessment. They did not call a faceless conglomerate. They called my private number. I delivered aggressive speed. I delivered crystal-clear ledgers. Most importantly, I absorbed their institutional panic and reflected back absolute control. But being the ultimate crisis manager exacted a heavy toll. By the time my company hit the 8-figure revenue mark, I had effectively turned my own personality into a titanium vault. I lived on black coffee, pure adrenaline, and perhaps 4 hours of sleep a night. I had no hobbies, no social circle outside of roofing contractors, and my emotional bandwidth was practically zero. That was the exact, hardened version of myself that Nolan Weller bumped into. I was 33 years old, financially untouchable, and profoundly lonely, though I would have rather swallowed glass than admit it. We met at a mundane charity gala in Midtown Atlanta, an event I only attended to corner a municipal zoning director. Nolan was there shooting a promotional documentary for the organizers. He possessed a magnetic, easygoing energy that stood in stark contrast to my rigid, high-alert posture. He did not care about my profit margins or my vendor compliance metrics. He looked at me, standing in the corner in a severe, tailored suit, and made a terribly cheesy joke about the dry chicken being served. It caught me entirely off guard. I laughed. It was a rusty, unfamiliar sound. Nolan walked right past my heavy defenses and brought a sudden, vibrant color to my gray world. He introduced me to late-night Italian food, obscure jazz vinyl records, and Sunday mornings where the alarm clock remained blissfully silent. He made me feel like I was not just a hyper-efficient machine built for processing disaster contracts, but a living, breathing woman who still possessed the capacity to be adored. He softened my edges. Then, 3 years ago, the operational scale of Palisade shifted dramatically. We began aggressively bidding on state-level infrastructure recovery programs, and the sheer volume of bureaucratic red tape was threatening to drown me. Enter Delaney Cross. She walked into my office for a final interview, took one sweeping look at my chaotic, floor-to-ceiling whiteboard of pending municipal bids, and systematically dismantled and rebuilt my entire organizational flow within 20 minutes. She was razor-sharp, endlessly resourceful, and completely unsentimental. She spoke the exact, sterile dialect of risk mitigation, equity scaling, and legal compliance that the institutional investors and state boards demanded. I was chronically exhausted from carrying the mental load of the entire enterprise on my own shoulders. Delaney offered to carry half of the sky. I handed it to her eagerly. I named her Chief Operating Officer. I treated her like a sister in arms, the only other woman in the executive room who truly understood the brutal gravity of what we did. Looking back from the cold reality of tonight, my descent into this betrayal was paved entirely by my own desperate need for relief. I was so profoundly grateful for Nolan's emotional warmth and Delaney's operational brilliance that I completely dismantled my own boundaries. I wanted to reward them. I allowed Nolan to step out from behind the camera and become the polished, charismatic face of our high-tier client appreciation events. I let him wine and dine the hospital administrators and school board presidents on the company expense account. Simultaneously, I granted Delaney unchecked access to the deepest, most sensitive operational layers of Palisade. I gave her sweeping signature authority on vendor payouts and autonomous control over our supply chain logistics. I convinced myself that I needed to step back, to focus strictly on the macro vision and our 10-year expansion strategy. So, I let my husband and my chief operating officer handle the daily ground game. I gave them endless, unsupervised hours together, supposedly to align our public relations strategy with our operational capacities. I built the walled garden, locked them inside together, and threw away the key. The red flags did not arrive with the dramatic force of a hurricane. They seeped into my life slowly, like toxic mold spreading quietly behind a freshly painted wall. The signs were agonizingly mundane, rooted in the everyday details of modern American life. Nolan's smartphone, which used to sit face up on the kitchen island while we cooked, began living perpetually face down. He suddenly changed his passcode from our wedding anniversary date to a random string of numbers, claiming a new corporate security update required it. Delaney began scheduling joint site visits with Nolan that stretched on for absurd lengths of time. A simple preliminary walkthrough of a water-damaged high school in Savannah would somehow demand 3 full days and 2 nights of their combined attention. When I asked basic logistical questions about these trips, they developed a perfectly choreographed routine. They would exchange a brief, almost imperceptible knowing glance, and then Delaney would smoothly assure me they were just handling the granular local politics, so I did not have to. Then came the executive meetings where I found myself subtly, politely excluded. I would walk into the glass-walled conference room, and the rapid-fire conversation would instantly pivot to something trivial. When I inquired why I was dropped from a specific vendor negotiation email thread, Delaney would place a warm, sisterly hand on my arm. She would look me dead in the eye and say I was simply too busy charting our expansion into the Carolinas to be bogged down with administrative noise. That is the part that burns like acid in the back of my throat right now. It is not just the physical act of their affair, it is the insidious, psychological way they manage to make me gaslight myself. I would feel that primal, twisting knot of intuition in my stomach. A quiet, persistent voice in my head kept warning me that they were standing too close, laughing too intimately, moving in a synchronized rhythm that deliberately shut me out. But instead of trusting my gut, I would sit alone in my office, rubbing my temples, and actively convince myself that I was being a paranoid fool. I blamed my chronic exhaustion. I blamed the crushing stress of managing a workforce of over 300 people. I fed myself the modern corporate lie that successful, independent women do not act like jealous, insecure, clinging wives. I rationalized my own acute intuition into total submission because I simply could not bear the thought of losing the 2 foundational pillars holding up my carefully constructed life. I convinced myself that my anxiety was the price of overworking, not the blaring alarm bell of an active betrayal. I sit here now in the quiet dark of my home, bathed only in the stark blue light of my computer monitor, tracing the invisible lines of my own engineered ruin. I gave them both absolutely everything they needed to destroy me. I handed Nolan the softest, most vulnerable parts of my heart, and I handed Delaney the master keys to my life's work. I committed the ultimate fatal sin of the self-made woman. In both the sacred, intimate vows of marriage and the cutthroat, unforgiving arena of corporate business, I made one monumental mistake. I genuinely, foolishly believed that providing someone with vast opportunity, recognizing their exceptional competence, and offering them my profound gratitude would somehow automatically manufacture their absolute loyalty. The unraveling of my entire reality did not begin with a stray trace of expensive perfume on a shirt collar, nor did it start with a whispered, late-night phone call abruptly ended when I walked into the room. It started with a profoundly mundane, quarterly accounts payable ledger. I was running a routine, high-level audit on our secondary vendor disbursements on a quiet Tuesday evening when a specific, anomalous line item snagged my absolute attention. It was a consulting fee, categorized neatly under public relations and strategic alignment. The payee was listed as a corporate entity named Pacific Ridge Advisory. I pride myself on knowing the exact name of every single contractor, subcontractor, material supplier, and consulting firm that draws a paycheck from my operations. I had never heard of Pacific Ridge Advisory in my life. I immediately cross-referenced our master vendor directory. The search yielded 0 results. I had never signed an onboarding approval form for them, nor had I ever authorized any exploratory budget for external strategic alignment in that quarter. I pulled the digital invoice and the corresponding internal email thread, authorizing the wire transfer. The authorization chain was technically intact, but the structure of it was entirely unorthodox and aggressively fast-tracked. The primary approval email bore the secure digital signature of my husband. He had signed off on the expense under the vague, completely unquantifiable justification of regional brand integration. But he did not have the executive authority to trigger a payment of that size independently. His departmental budget was strictly capped, and any overages required my direct sign-off. The secondary approval, the one that actually commanded the finance department to release the funds immediately, belonged to my chief operating officer. The email from her was terse, demanding expedited processing before the close of the fiscal quarter, citing a critical vendor relationship. It was a seamless, beautifully executed bureaucratic bypass. He created the fictional justification. She pushed the executive button. They moved the money directly around my desk, relying on the sheer volume of our weekly transactions to bury the theft. I did not confront them. I did not storm down the hallway demanding answers. I simply flagged the transaction in my mind, backed up the ledger to a secure, encrypted external drive, and waited. 4 days later, the universe handed me the missing piece of the puzzle, wrapped in absolute domestic banality. I was in my own living room, trying to pull up a digital recipe on the old family tablet that we kept on the coffee table. The device was still linked to a shared family cloud account that my husband rarely used anymore, assuming I never checked it. A calendar notification popped up on the screen, a leftover background sync from his primary mobile device. It was a confirmation for a highly exclusive, private villa reservation in Maui. The booking was clearly marked for 2 adults. I opened the details, my heart beating with a slow, heavy, mechanical rhythm. The reservation had been secured exactly 4 months prior. I checked the dates against my own schedule. They aligned perfectly with a major regional trade conference in Nevada that my partner had heavily insisted I skip, arguing that she should handle the networking herself while I focused on a massive school board bid in Atlanta. If I had been a different kind of woman, I would have printed the itinerary, slammed it onto the dining room table, and demanded a tearful, screaming confession. Instead, I quietly closed the application, cleared the screen cache, carefully wiped my fingerprints from the glass, and placed the tablet back onto the table exactly where I had found it. The very next morning, I drove right past my own corporate headquarters and walked directly into the downtown offices of Mara Duval. Mara is a senior corporate litigator who specializes in hostile takeovers, complex shareholder disputes, and aggressive executive severances. She is not a family law attorney. She is a wartime executive counselor. I slid a physical copy of the Pacific Ridge Ledger across her massive mahogany desk. I told her I needed an external, completely off-the-books forensic financial expert immediately. By noon, Mara had securely connected me with Elias Trent, a forensic auditor who could trace a single stolen dime through a labyrinth of shell companies and offshore accounts without ever triggering an internal alarm. For the next 7 months, I lived a grueling psychological dual existence. During the day, I was the visionary leader, smiling warmly in boardrooms, publicly praising my husband's media campaigns, and nodding along thoughtfully to my partner's operational reports. I drank coffee with them in the break room. I discussed quarterly revenue projections with them. At night, locked behind the encrypted firewall of my personal home workstation, I became a ghost hunting in my own machine. I directed Elias to quietly pull the deep back-end logs of our enterprise resource planning software. We did not just look at what documents were filed. We looked at the invisible digital footprints of who opened them, exactly when they were modified, and whose specific user credentials were attached to the changes. I ordered a silent, comprehensive audit of the bank's signatory rights and the legal addendums for every municipal bid my chief operating officer had touched since the beginning of the calendar year. The pattern Elias and I uncovered over those weeks was methodical, infinitely patient, and deeply chilling. My partner was systematically laying the legal groundwork to expand her unilateral signing authority on our primary commercial credit line. She was drafting subtle, highly technical amendments to our operating agreement, burying clauses in routine legal updates that would effectively dilute my absolute veto power over massive financial maneuvers. She was positioning herself to be able to leverage the company's hard assets without my explicit, written consent. Simultaneously, Elias found my husband's digital fingerprints crawling all over our secure internal bidding servers. His media position required absolutely zero access to our proprietary pricing models or contractor margin data, yet his user account was quietly tethered to dozens of highly classified internal email threads regarding our most lucrative upcoming contracts in the public sector. He was hovering in the digital background, silently observing the flow of our capital and identifying our strategic vulnerabilities. This was the genesis of the secure directory I named North Exit. I did not create it to hoard painful memories or to fuel my own personal heartbreak. It was a sterile, highly organized digital vault. Every suspicious invoice, every altered portable document format file, every intercepted communication, and every line of incriminating metadata was meticulously categorized, time-stamped, and archived. I cataloged the exact dates of their secret meetings alongside the corresponding spikes in unauthorized data access on our servers. I was not building a messy case for a family court judge to win a favorable alimony settlement. I was building a federal-grade indictment for corporate sabotage and fraud. I filed away the evidence of their deceit with the detached, mechanical precision of a trauma surgeon preparing her instruments for a long, bloody operation. I was not reacting to the destruction of my marriage anymore. I was preparing for the exact moment I would need to clear the corruption out of my life's work. As the North Exit folder grew heavier with gigabytes of undeniable, time-stamped proof, the true nature of their alliance crystallized in my mind with absolute, terrifying clarity. The whispered conversations and the stolen glances were merely the superficial symptoms of a much deeper, terminal disease. The private villa in Hawaii was not a romantic getaway paid for by a cheating husband blinded by sudden passion. It was a strategic celebration funded entirely by corporate espionage. I realized then, sitting entirely alone in the harsh blue glow of my monitors, that the ultimate betrayal was not happening in a hotel bed at all. It was happening in my ledgers, in my boardrooms, and in the foundational architecture of the empire I had bled to build. They were not just a couple of tragic lovers caught up in an illicit romance. They were domestic terrorists, and their sordid affair was nothing more than a convenient, ugly camouflage for a highly calculated corporate heist. They were trying to steal my life's work, and they were using my own blind trust to quietly pick the locks. The digital clock in the corner of my secondary monitor flipped to 11:44 at night. Exactly 60 seconds had passed since the photograph of the floral leis and the smug smiles had illuminated my phone screen. 60 seconds was all the time I allocated to the death of my marriage. The mourning period was officially over. Now, the surgery had to begin. My hands hovered over the illuminated mechanical keyboard for a fraction of a second, feeling the heavy metallic silence of the house pressing against the walls. Then, my fingers descended, moving with the brutal, blinding speed of a bomb technician who knows exactly which wires will cause the entire structure to detonate. I did not open a blank Word document to draft an emotional email, nor did I reach for my phone to scream into the receiver. I opened the master administrative terminal for Palisade Renewal Group. I bypassed the standard user interface and dove straight into the foundational security architecture of our enterprise network. The first target was the absolute center of our operational gravity. I located the active user profile belonging to my chief operating officer. With 3 rapid, deliberate keystrokes, I severed her connection to the central bidding data vault and the master contract repository. The system prompted me for a secondary confirmation to revoke executive privileges. I hit the enter key so hard, the plastic switch cracked against the aluminum backplate. Instantly, her access permissions evaporated. If she tried to open a single spreadsheet, a vendor agreement, or a municipal dossier from her luxury suite in Hawaii, she would be met with a cold, blank screen citing a fatal server error. The data was secured, but data was only half of the equation. Blood flow in corporate warfare is measured entirely in liquid capital. I switched to the encrypted portal of our primary commercial bank. I bypassed the standard dual-factor authentication using a physical security token I had kept locked in my desk drawer for 6 weeks. I navigated directly to the master treasury controls. I drafted an irrevocable, emergency administrative order modifying the foundational parameters of our corporate accounts. Effective immediately, any outbound wire transfer, certified check issuance, or cash withdrawal exceeding $25,000 required absolute, non-delegable authorization. The new mandate demanded my direct, biometric approval alongside a secondary, External legal verification from Mara Duval. The bank's server accepted the override protocol in less than 4 seconds, says. In the span of a single breath, the financial arteries of Palisade were clamped shut. My partner could not authorize the purchase of a mid-sized sedan right now, let alone maneuver millions of dollars in company capital to fund her silent coup. I had just turned her executive signature into worthless ink. Next, I turned the weaponized precision of my administrative rights onto my husband. I located his footprint within our network. I systematically crushed his access to the entire digital brand asset library, the company cloud architecture, and the high-capacity video storage servers. He was instantly locked out of every piece of media he had ever created for my company. But severing his professional existence was not enough. I needed to cauterize the personal vulnerabilities as well. I opened the smart home management console on my private network. The sprawling house I was currently sitting in was not marital property. It was securely shielded within an ironclad, prenuptial trust I had established long before I ever met him. I located his user profile in the residential security matrix. I deleted his biometric data from the front door scanners. I wiped his smartphone's digital key. Finally, I scrambled the keypad code to the garage, changing it to a random, newly generated 12-digit sequence. If he somehow managed to find a flight back to Atlanta tonight, he would find himself standing on the pavement, completely locked out of the fortress he thought he co-owned. The defensive perimeter was now fully established. It was time to pour the digital concrete. I initiated the most aggressive, uncompromising protocol available to a chief executive officer facing an internal breach. I triggered an enterprise-wide legal hold. This was not a simple company memo asking employees to save their work. This was a sweeping, automated, system-level lockdown. The instant the command executed, the central servers froze the current state of the entire company architecture. Every single email sent or received, every casual internal chat message, every deleted draft, every document modification log, and every second of footage from our closed-circuit office cameras was instantly mirrored, encrypted, and locked in a pristine, untouchable vault. No one in the entire organization, not even the network administrators, could alter, delete, or obscure a single byte of data from this moment backward. The battlefield was perfectly preserved in amber. With the perimeter sealed and the evidence frozen, I transitioned from defense to active offense. I opened my encrypted email client and attached the massive, meticulously organized compressed file containing the entire North Exit dossier. I addressed the message to Mara Duval. The subject line was blank. The body of the email contained only 2 sentences. They made the move. We answer at sunrise. I pressed send, watching the progress bar shoot across the screen as gigabytes of absolute ruin were transmitted to my legal counsel. There was one final, critical piece to place on the board before the night ended. I drafted a separate, highly sanitized email to the independent chairman of our board of directors. The tone was deliberately sterile, professional, and devoid of any emotional contamination. I did not mention the private villa, the floral leis, or the shattering of my marital vows. I wrote strictly in the language of corporate risk management. I informed the chairman that I had uncovered substantial evidence indicating a severe, undeclared conflict of interest within the executive team. I stated clearly that this conflict had the immediate potential to aggressively impact critical governance decisions within the next 24 hours. I requested that he put the entire board on emergency standby for an immediate briefing at the start of the business day. Just as my finger lifted from the mouse after sending the board notification, the heavy silence of the room was shattered by the harsh, vibrating buzz of my phone against the wooden desk. The screen lit up. It was him. A rapid succession of text messages began flooding in. He was mocking my silence. He was asking if I was currently crying on the kitchen floor. He threw out sharp, petty insults, desperately trying to fish for a reaction, begging for me to unleash a torrent of jealous rage so he could feel the intoxicating power of breaking me. I stared at the glowing screen, watching his pathetic attempts to solicit my grief. I felt absolutely nothing but a profound, chilling clarity. I did not type a single letter in response. From this exact microsecond forward, I would never speak to either of them using my own voice again. The era of conversation was permanently closed. From now on, I would only speak to them through forensic accounting ledgers, devastating legal injunctions, and unanimous board resolutions. I pushed my chair back, the wheels gliding smoothly over the hardwood floor. I stood up and walked slowly toward the massive, floor-to-ceiling glass window that dominated the far wall of my office. Below me, the sprawling electric grid of Atlanta burned with a fierce, restless energy. Millions of lights cut through the suffocating darkness of the southern night. I pressed my palm flat against the cool, thick pane of glass. Thousands of miles away, surrounded by the dark waters of the Pacific, two arrogant people were likely ordering another bottle of expensive champagne, toasting to their brilliant, flawless victory. They believed they had just pushed me off a cliff. They were completely, blissfully unaware that in the last 15 minutes, I had quietly, methodically reached out and severed the oxygen lines to every single one of their meticulously laid plans. They thought they owned the narrative, but they were already dead in the water, just waiting for the sun to rise so I could show them the corpse. At exactly 8 o'clock the following morning, the chimes of my calendar application broke the sterile silence of my office. It was an automated notification for an emergency, unscheduled convening of the board of directors. The digital summons had been officially initiated by my chief operating officer just 10 minutes prior. Attached to the meeting invite was a draft resolution that was as breathtaking in its audacity as it was legally precarious. The agenda item was a formal motion to immediately transition me into the role of honorary founder. It was a sanitized, corporate euphemism for stripping me of all executive power, severing my daily operational control, and putting me out to pasture while the industry was supposedly distracted by the explosive scandal of my personal life. Their strategy was exceptionally cruel, yet structurally brilliant if it had been deployed against a weaker target. As I watched the digital clock tick forward, my phone began intercepting automated alerts from our brand monitoring software. The wedding photographs from Hawaii were going live across all major social networking platforms. They were actively seeding the narrative. They wanted the board and our primary investors to see a woman utterly devastated by a sudden, humiliating marital collapse. They were manufacturing a crisis of confidence, painting a picture of a chief executive officer who was too emotionally compromised, too deeply unstable, to guide a multi-million-dollar disaster recovery firm. While Delaney was orchestrating the boardroom coup, my husband was simultaneously launching a shadow campaign against my client base. Through the communications monitoring protocols I had locked into place the night before, I could see the outgoing call logs from his company-issued mobile device, which he was foolishly still using over the island wireless network. He was dialing our oldest, most lucrative municipal clients. I listened to a cached recording of a voicemail he left for a county commissioner in Georgia. His voice dripped with practiced, somber empathy. He claimed he was stepping up to help the company navigate a highly sensitive leadership transition. He spoke about me in the past tense, as if I had already been quietly removed and placed in a psychiatric facility. They were moving at lightning speed, trying to establish a new reality on the ground before I even had a chance to put on my shoes. At exactly 8:30 in the morning, I clicked the encrypted link to join the remote video conference. The screen populated with the faces of the 5 board members, looking deeply uncomfortable and grim. Then, Delaney's camera feed flared to life. She was sitting in the brightly lit, expensive business center of her resort. She wore a crisp, white silk blouse, projecting an aura of reluctant, heavy-hearted responsibility. When my camera activated, the entire digital room went dead silent. I did not look like a woman who had spent the night weeping into a pillow. I wore a charcoal gray blazer. My hair was pulled back into a severe knot, and my expression was a mask of absolute, terrifying stone. I did not say a single word. I simply stared directly into the lens of my webcam, letting the suffocating weight of my silence press against the digital bandwidth. Delaney cleared her throat, clearly unsettled by my physical appearance, but she pushed forward with her rehearsed script. "Thank you all for convening on such incredibly short notice," she began. her tone a masterclass in feigned sympathy. As you are likely becoming aware, there has been a sudden and severe disruption in Scarlett's personal life. Given the intense, round-the-clock demands of our current municipal contracts, I am deeply concerned about her capacity to maintain the rigorous operational tempo required. For the safety of our ongoing bids, and to protect Scarlett from the crushing pressure of leading while managing a devastating personal crisis, I am proposing an immediate, temporary restructuring. We need to shield the company from an emotional executive. I am ready to step in as acting chief executive. She finished her pitch, waiting for the inevitable murmurs of agreement from the older men on the board, who naturally feared corporate instability. "Are you finished, Delaney?" I asked. My voice was completely flat, devoid of any inflection. Before she could formulate a response, a new video tile popped into the conference grid. Mara Duval leaned into her frame, sitting at her massive desk, flanked by thick legal binders. "Good morning, gentlemen," Mara said, her voice slicing through the tension like a straight razor. "I am acting strictly as personal executive counsel for the founder. Before anyone entertains a vote that will immediately trigger a tidal wave of shareholder litigation, I suggest you look at the screen." Mara shared her screen, projecting a highlighted section of the company's foundational operating agreement. "Article 4, Section 7, Mara read aloud, enunciating every single syllable. "Any forced alteration of the chief executive officer's title, any assumption of new corporate debt exceeding $500,000, and any transfer of proprietary client data requires the explicit written founder consent of Scarlett Ross. A board supermajority cannot override this clause without triggering an automatic, unappealable liquidation of all unvested executive shares. In short, Delaney, you do not have the legal authority to call this vote, let alone win it." The color instantly drained from Delaney's face. The confident, sympathetic usurper vanished, replaced by a woman staring down the barrel of a legal firing squad. "This is an emergency provision," Delaney stammered, her voice tightening. "The board has a fiduciary duty to act if the founder is compromised." "The only person compromised in this meeting is you," a new voice interjected. Elias Trent's camera feed went live. He did not bother with pleasantries. He immediately shared his own screen, projecting a dense, highly complex forensic accounting flowchart. "My name is Elias Trent. I am an independent forensic auditor retained by the founder. Over the past several hours, we have uncovered a pattern of severe, undeclared financial irregularities directly tied to the chief operating officer." Elias did not pause for dramatic effect. He weaponized the data. He highlighted the specific, irregular consulting fees we had tracked. "We have documented substantial, unauthorized capital outlays directed to a shadow entity known as Pacific Ridge Advisory. We possess the digital metadata proving that the chief operating officer actively accelerated these payments, bypassing standard compliance checks. Furthermore, we have verified preliminary evidence of an egregious, undisclosed conflict of interest that fundamentally breaches the Executive Code of Conduct and immediately threatens our current vendor negotiations." The silence in the virtual room was no longer uncomfortable. It was lethal. The chairman of the board, an older, fiercely conservative former banking executive, leaned close to his camera. "Miss Cross," the chairman said, his voice dropping an octave, "are you currently managing unauthorized corporate funds through a third-party advisory firm?" "This is a witch hunt," Delaney shot back, her professional veneer cracking entirely. "She is angry about her husband, so she is manufacturing a financial scandal to destroy me. I do not manufacture anything," I finally spoke, leaning into my own camera, making sure she could see the absolute zero in my eyes. "I just read the ledgers you thought I was too tired to check." The chairman did not hesitate. He possessed the ruthless survival instinct of a career financier. He immediately bypassed the original agenda. "The motion to restructure the chief executive role is dismissed," the chairman announced sharply. "Instead, the board hereby issues an immediate resolution to freeze all executive authority, signatory rights, and internal data access for the chief operating officer." "Delaney, You are suspended pending a full, independent forensic investigation to be completed within the next 72 hours. You are not to contact any vendors, and you are not to speak on behalf of this firm. The meeting disconnected abruptly. I sat back in my chair, the morning sunlight finally piercing through the glass windows of my office. The adrenaline was slowly receding, leaving behind a cold, hard clarity. The sheer, terrifying magnitude of their betrayal finally locked into place. They had not run away to Hawaii simply to escape a dead marriage or to throw their illicit affair in my face. The text message, the photograph, the perfectly timed insults, it was all a psychological smokescreen. They had intentionally weaponized the anticipated shock of a wife discovering her husband's infidelity. They needed me paralyzed, sobbing on the floor, and blinded by heartbreak just long enough for them to quietly assassinate my career and steal the empire I had spent over a decade building with my own 2 hands. They expected a victim. They got a fortress. At precisely 3 p.m, the suffocating quiet of my home office was pierced by a single, sharp vibration from my private cellular phone. I glanced at the screen, expecting another frantic, back-channel communication from an investor or perhaps a follow-up inquiry from the chairman of the board. Instead, the incoming message displayed an unrecognized number. The text was jagged, desperate, and entirely unexpected. It read that she needed to speak with me immediately, that she was terrified, and that she was currently sitting in her car in a parking garage because she had been ordered to destroy federal compliance records. The sender identified herself as Tessa Van. For a moment, I simply stared at the illuminated name. In the high-stakes, hyper-aggressive ecosystem of executive leadership, Tessa Van was practically a ghost. She was the executive assistant to my chief operating officer. For the past 2 years, Tessa had been the invisible machinery moving quietly in the background of our corporate headquarters. She was the woman who ordered the working lunches, meticulously managed the impossibly dense travel itineraries, and fetched the dry cleaning. To executives like Delaney and Nolan, an assistant like Tessa was not a human being with a moral compass. She was merely a piece of office furniture that occasionally handed them a printed spreadsheet. They never once considered that the furniture was listening to every single word they said. I did not reply with warmth or immediate trust. In corporate warfare, a sudden defector is often just a spy carrying a newly forged weapon. I texted her back with a single, non-negotiable directive. I told her to drive to a specific address in the downtown financial district, park in the secure underground structure, and take the private elevator to the 42nd floor. I gave her the suite number for Mara Duval's law firm. If Tessa was bringing me truth, it needed to be established immediately within the unbreakable fortress of attorney-client privilege and formal legal custody. 45 minutes later, I was sitting at the long, polished mahogany conference table in Mara's office. The heavy oak doors clicked open, and Tessa stepped inside. She looked completely shattered. She was a woman in her late 20s, wearing a standard, unassuming gray cardigan, clutching a cheap paper coffee cup like it was a life preserver. Her hands were visibly shaking. She did not look at me directly at first. She looked at the heavy legal volumes lining the walls, completely overwhelmed by the gravity of the room. Mara sat quietly at the head of the table, a blank legal pad resting in front of her, her expression carefully neutral. I offered Tessa a glass of water and told her to take her time. She sat down, unzipped her worn canvas tote bag, and placed a small, silver solid-state drive onto the center of the table. Tessa explained that right after the board meeting abruptly terminated that morning, Delaney had called her in an absolute, white-hot panic. The polished, untouchable executive had completely unraveled. Delaney had ordered Tessa to log into the administrative compliance portal and retroactively backdate a series of strict ethics disclosure forms, making it appear as though the conflict of interest had been properly documented months ago. More damningly, Delaney had commanded her to access the secondary backup servers and permanently purge a highly specific cluster of internal emails relating to Pacific Ridge Advisory. Delaney thought Tessa was too meek, too dependent on her meager salary to ever ask questions or refuse a direct order from the C-suite, but Tessa had not deleted the files. Instead, she had mirrored them onto the silver drive resting between us. Mara plugged the drive into her secure laptop, isolating it from her firm's main network. What populated on the screen was not just evidence of a hastily covered-up affair. It was a fully documented blueprint for a corporate slaughter. Tessa had brought us complete archives of internal chat logs, encrypted email threads, and most importantly, a 30-slide digital presentation created by Nolan and Delaney. The presentation was arrogantly titled Phase Shift. As Mara clicked through the slides, the sheer, breathtaking malice of their plan revealed itself in bullet points and timeline charts. The trip to Hawaii was never about reckless, impulsive romance. It was a meticulously scheduled operational milestone. The presentation detailed exactly how they planned to use the wedding photographs as a psychological weapon. They had plotted out the precise hour to send the text message, anticipating that the ensuing emotional trauma would completely paralyze my decision-making capabilities. They needed me utterly blinded by grief, so I would be physically and mentally absent while Delaney executed the boardroom coup to seize the chief executive seat within 48 hours. Then, the financial reality of the documents grew even darker. We opened the ledgers tied to the purged emails. Pacific Ridge Advisory was not just a hollow shell company used to quietly siphon a few $1,000s from my marketing budget to pay for their island vacation. It was a highly organized kickback vehicle. The documents revealed that 3 of our largest, most desperate supply chain vendors had been quietly funneling massive 6-figure payments into Pacific Ridge under the guise of strategic consulting fees. In exchange, Delaney was actively manipulating our proprietary algorithms and internal bidding processes to guarantee those specific vendors won our most lucrative public contracts. This was no longer just a nasty corporate divorce. It was a sprawling, systemic bribery ring involving public infrastructure funds. I was absorbing the sheer, terrifying scale of the fraud with cold, analytical precision until Mara clicked on a stray multimedia file buried deep within a chat log between my husband and my business partner. It was a short audio recording, a voice memo Nolan had sent to Delaney late one night, likely from the driver's seat of his car while parked in our own garage. Mara hit play. The high-fidelity speakers in the conference room broadcasted my husband's voice with sickening clarity. He was laughing. It was a relaxed, confident, deeply cruel sound. "Do not worry about the blast radius." Nolan's recorded voice echoed off the wood-paneled walls. "I know how she operates. I know her baseline. When she sees the picture, she is not going to break plates or call a lawyer. She is too guarded for that. She is too proud to scream in public, so she will just die standing in silence. She will freeze. She will isolate herself, and by the time she realizes she has to fight back, we will already have the keys to the kingdom." The audio cut off, leaving a ringing, heavy silence in its wake. Until that exact second, I had been operating entirely on adrenaline, logic, and a fierce, protective instinct for the company I had built. I had locked away the human being inside a titanium vault so the chief executive officer could go to war, but that recording was a blade that slid effortlessly between the plates of my armor. The most devastating realization was not that he was stealing from me, or even that he was sleeping with another woman. The profound, breathless agony came from the realization that he had spent years studying the most intimate, vulnerable parts of my psychology, my stoicism, my fear of public humiliation, my tendency to withdraw under extreme stress, and he had actively weaponized those exact traits to destroy me. He had used my own trauma responses as the foundational strategy for his corporate heist. I felt a sudden, freezing drop in my core temperature. I closed my eyes for 3 long seconds, feeling the sharp sting of a betrayal so deep it transcended anger. I took a slow, measured breath, forcing the oxygen into my lungs, and consciously locked the vault door shut once again. I opened my eyes. I looked across the table at Tessa. She was crying silently, tears spilling onto the collar of her gray cardigan, overwhelmed by the viciousness she had just exposed. The people who claimed to love me, the people I had elevated to the highest peaks of power and wealth, had studied me like a predator studies prey. But this quiet, terrified assistant, a woman who owed me absolutely nothing, had risked her entire livelihood and her professional future simply because she could not stomach the profound injustice of their cruelty. Mara reached into a heavy manila folder and smoothly slid a thick stack of stapled papers across the table toward Tessa. It was a formal, ironclad whistleblower protection agreement. "Sign this," Mara said softly, placing a heavy metal pen beside the document. "The second your signature hits this page, you are under the full protection of federal employment law and my firm's litigation umbrella. They will not be able to touch your salary, your career, or your reputation." I leaned forward, resting my forearms on the cool wood of the table, looking directly into Tessa's frightened eyes. The coldness in my chest was gone, replaced by a quiet, burning solidarity. "You do not work for them anymore," I told her, my voice steady and completely devoid of fear. "You work for me now, and no one who stands by me in this room is ever going to be invisible again." Tessa picked up the pen. Her hand was no longer shaking. She signed her name with a sharp, definitive stroke. In that quiet room, high above the streets of Atlanta, the most easily pressured employee in the entire company had just become the primary witness who would shatter their fabricated empire into dust. They launched their offensive in the realm of public relations, banking on the modern obsession with optics and emotional vulnerability. By Tuesday morning, Nolan's voice was broadcasting across a highly popular, luxury lifestyle audio program. He sat in a velvet chair in a soundproof studio somewhere in Los Angeles, speaking in that smooth, practiced baritone that used to make me smile. Now, he was using it to carefully dismantle my character. He painted a picture of a suffocating, hyper-masculine woman who was hopelessly addicted to control. He told the host, with a perfectly timed sigh, that I had systematically stripped the romance from our lives, effectively turning our sacred marriage into an exhausting employment contract. He positioned himself as a creative soul slowly dying in the sterile, unyielding grip of a corporate dictator. Simultaneously, a prominent regional business and lifestyle publication released a massive, brightly colored feature article centered entirely on Delaney. The piece was a masterpiece of modern narrative manipulation. It completely bypassed the grim reality of corporate theft and adultery, instead softening her betrayal into a brave, feminist narrative. The article framed her as a brilliant, overworked executive who finally found the courage to walk away from a profoundly toxic, emotionally stunted work environment to claim her own authentic happiness. They were trying to rebrand a calculated corporate coup as an inspiring story of personal liberation. They wanted the public, our clients, and our investors to see them as the victims of my supposed tyranny. The internet immediately responded. My social media channels began to flood with notifications, direct messages, and comments from strangers demanding my side of the story. The standard playbook for a scorned, high-profile woman dictated that I should fight back in the same arena. I was supposed to post a tearful, unpolished video denying the allegations. I was supposed to leak passive-aggressive text messages to gossip blogs. I was supposed to hire a crisis management firm to draft a lengthy, emotionally charged statement about my broken heart and my unwavering resilience. I did absolutely none of those things. I did not log into a single social media platform. I did not speak to a single reporter. I did not shed a single tear for the public to consume. I remained inside my office, sipping black coffee, and wrapped myself in a silence so complete and absolute it felt like a physical weapon. I let them have the microphone, the podcast downloads, and the sympathetic magazine covers. I let them build their flimsy house of cards in the shifting winds of public opinion. I did not care about optics. I cared about the raw, undeniable architecture of the law. While they were busy giving interviews, I authorized Mara Duval to deploy the ordnance. We did not hold a dramatic press conference. We simply dispatched 3 highly encrypted, password-protected digital packages to a very specific, carefully curated list of recipients. We sent them to the private inboxes of our board of directors, to the managing editors of 3 heavyweight investigative financial journals, and straight to the chief procurement officers of our 3 largest municipal clients. The first package was a masterclass in establishing fiduciary breach. It contained no emotional appeals, only timelines and signatures. It categorically proved that Delaney and Nolan had actively engaged in a deeply entwined, romantic relationship for over a year. The timeline was juxtaposed against a meticulous ledger of executive decisions. It showed that while they were secretly sharing hotel rooms and booking flights together, they were also sitting across from each other in official committee meetings, jointly approving massive operational budgets and vetting external vendors without ever submitting a standard conflict of interest disclosure to the board. They had fundamentally violated the bedrock of corporate governance. The second package was the financial kill shot. It completely dismantled the romantic illusion of their Hawaiian escape. This file contained the complete forensic money trail mapped out by Elias Trent. It traced the hundreds of thousands of dollars flowing from our desperate supply chain vendors directly into the dark accounts of Pacific Ridge Advisory. From there, the package illustrated exactly where that money went. It highlighted the massive 6-figure cash wire transfer used as a security deposit for a luxury beachfront condominium in Maui. It listed dozens of exorbitant, recurring strategic consulting fees that completely lacked any corresponding deliverables, work product, or tangible company benefit. It proved that their beautiful new life together was financed entirely by stolen capital and illegal kickbacks. The third and final package was the most technically devastating. Thanks to the server mirrors provided by Tessa, we did not just have copies of documents. We had the raw, unalterable digital DNA of those documents. The third package contained the exhaustive metadata logs. It clearly displayed the exact time and date stamps, proving that Delaney had frantically logged into the system and digitally altered legal affidavits, compliance reports, and vendor agreements. She had manipulated the files to make it appear as though she had signed them weeks prior, desperately trying to cover her tracks after the board had already suspended her. This was not a simple breach of company policy. This package opened the heavy, terrifying door to federal charges for the forgery of corporate documents and the destruction of digital evidence. The impact of the 3 packages was not measured in social media likes or podcast downloads. It was measured in immediate, catastrophic financial gridlock. Within 24 hours of Mara transmitting the files, the entire landscape of the war shifted violently. 2 of our most massive clients, sprawling county school districts currently negotiating 8-figure recovery contracts, immediately froze all pending project awards that bore Delaney's signature. They issued formal notices citing severe concerns over vendor integrity. By that same afternoon, a major commercial property insurance syndicate halted the release of a massive escrow check. They refused to fund the next phase of a hospital rebuild until they could conduct their own independent verification of our internal auditing procedures. The money stopped moving. The contracts froze in midair. The board of directors, now terrified of federal regulatory blowback, went into absolute lockdown, distancing themselves completely from Delaney and her fabricated narrative. As the sun set on Atlanta that evening, the reality of the situation finally settled over the chessboard. For the past week, Nolan and Delaney had operated under the arrogant assumption that they were fighting a jilted, emotional wife who would eventually tire herself out with screaming and crying. They thought they could win by being louder, by being more charming, and by manipulating the social narrative. But as the legal notices began to hit their inboxes, and as their vendor contacts suddenly stopped returning their calls, the chilling truth finally dawned on them. I was not fighting them with emotion. I was not trying to win a popularity contest. I was calmly, systematically suffocating them with my absolute, terrifying capacity to prove the truth. They realized, far too late, that all the beautiful podcast interviews in the world could not protect them from a time-stamped ledger. The true horror of a betrayal is rarely found in the grand, sweeping actions. It is not the forged signatures on the operating agreement or the stolen hundreds of thousands of dollars sitting in a Hawaiian bank account. The true horror lives in the microscopic, intimate details. As Elias Trent and Mara Duval continued to excavate the massive cache of data secured on Tessa's silver drive, they moved past the financial ledgers and breached a deeply personal hidden directory Delaney had kept on her local machine. Inside that folder, I found the absolute bottom of the abyss. It became violently clear that my husband had not merely been a passive beneficiary of my chief operating officer's financial crimes. Nolan had been the primary intelligence gatherer, the domestic spy embedded within my own walls. For the past 18 months, while I was sleeping in the master bedroom down the hall, he had been regularly sneaking into my locked home office. He had meticulously photographed my private, handwritten strategic notebooks. He had captured high-resolution images of my whiteboard where I mapped out my own psychological forecasts for company morale and executive endurance. Most devastatingly, he had found the encrypted digital voice recorder I kept locked in the bottom drawer of my heavy oak desk. For over 5 years, at the strict recommendation of my executive therapist, I had been recording private audio journals immediately after my clinical sessions. They were raw, unfiltered audio files, where I confessed my deepest insecurities, my crushing battles with executive imposter syndrome, and my intense, exhausting fear of being perceived as an aggressively difficult, unlovable woman in a male-dominated industry. Nolan had downloaded every single hour of audio. He had transferred gigabytes of my most vulnerable, unguarded thoughts directly to the woman plotting to destroy me. They did not just sleep together in expensive hotel beds. They had convened a masterclass on how to dismantle my sanity. I read through their private, encrypted chat logs, where they actively analyzed my psychological triggers like laboratory researchers observing a specimen. They studied me like a complex, fragile operating system, identifying exactly which emotional inputs would cause a catastrophic systemic failure. They knew that my immediate trauma response was to retreat into absolute silence and shoulder the blame internally. They knew my absolute terror of public, messy emotional scenes. They calculated with chilling precision that if they struck me hard enough with a shocking, humiliating blow, I would instinctively fold inward, question my own reality, and ultimately paralyze myself with self-doubt. But the documents revealed an even darker, more lethal failsafe. If the text message from Maui failed to induce a complete nervous breakdown, Delaney had a secondary explosive device primed and ready to detonate. Tessa's mirrored drive contained a fully drafted, highly polished whistleblower packet. It was a masterpiece of fabricated compliance violations. It was designed to be sent anonymously to the chairman of every single municipal school board and hospital investor network on our active client roster. The packet contained manipulated evidence accusing me of the exact crime Delaney was actually committing: gross vendor favoritism and illegal kickback schemes. It specifically targeted the massive Charleston hospital rebuild, alleging I had bypassed the blind bidding protocol to favor a specific flooring contractor. It was a perfectly engineered character assassination. Delaney understood that Palisade Renewal Group was my child, my ultimate legacy. Her strategy was to frame me so completely that I would be forced to voluntarily resign my position as chief executive officer just to protect the brand's honor from a devastating public scandal. If I had panicked that night in my office, if I had lost my temper, thrown a glass, or sent a raging, emotional email to the board of directors, I would have walked perfectly into their trap. I would have lost my husband, my flawless industry reputation, my lucrative public contracts, and the ironclad position I had spent 13 grueling years building from the ground up. For the first time since the photograph of the floral leis arrived on my phone, the protective titanium vault inside my chest cracked wide open. I left Mara's downtown office just after 6 o'clock in the evening. The Atlanta air was thick and heavy with the suffocating humidity of a late summer storm. I walked into the subterranean parking garage, the damp concrete echoing with the hollow, solitary sound of my own footsteps. I unlocked my luxury sedan, climbed into the driver's seat, and slammed the heavy door shut, sealing myself inside the quiet cabin. I did not start the engine. I just sat there in the dim, artificial light of the garage, gripping the leather steering wheel until my knuckles turned stark white and my wrists ached. The sheer, absolute violation washed over me in a crushing wave. The deepest, most agonizing wound was not the infidelity. People cheat. Marriages fail every single day in mundane, predictable ways. The agonizing, breathless pain was the realization that Nolan understood me better than anyone else on the surface of the earth, and he had used that profound, intimate knowledge as a surgical scalpel to hollow me out. He knew exactly where my armor was thin. He knew exactly where my old childhood scars were buried, and he had carefully, gleefully guided Delaney's blade right into the softest, most unprotected tissue. I pressed my forehead against the cold steering wheel. In the absolute quiet of the garage, surrounded by rows of empty concrete pillars, I finally allowed myself to feel the catastrophic grief of being entirely, profoundly unseen and unloved by the man I had trusted with my life. But as the seconds ticked by in the dark, the grief began to mutate. The corrosive, agonizing sorrow slowly hardened into something entirely different, something forged in iron. For days, an insidious voice in the back of my mind had been whispering the classic, pathetic questions of the betrayed wife. What was I lacking? Why was I not enough to keep his attention? Did I work too many hours? Was I too cold, too demanding, too focused on the corporate ledger to be a warm, desirable partner? Sitting in the driver's seat, staring at the concrete wall in front of me, those questions suddenly evaporated into the heavy air. They felt utterly absurd. The correct question was not about my personal deficiencies or my executive flaws. The correct question was far more potent. Why did I ever allow two greedy, fundamentally mediocre people to hold the pen that defined my personal and professional worth? I lifted my heavy head. I looked at my own reflection in the rearview mirror. My eyes were red from the crushing weight of the exhaustion, but they were completely, entirely dry. The season for weeping had never even arrived. I made a silent, unbreakable vow to myself right there in the underground shadows. I was not going to demand my marriage back. I did not want to save a union built on espionage. I was not going to demand my friendship back from the woman who had poisoned my corporate well. I did not even want a tearful apology from either of them. An apology requires a functional human conscience, and I was dealing with corporate sociopaths who measured human value in profit margins and power grabs. What I wanted was total scorched earth extraction. The only things I was going to take back were the undisputed, public truth and an empire that remained standing tall over their professional graves. I turned the key in the ignition. The powerful engine roared to life, the bright headlights cutting a sharp, blinding path through the darkness of the garage. I shifted the car into drive. The path forward was brilliantly, terrifyingly clear. I finally understood that from this exact moment onward, this was no longer a story about enacting petty revenge on two people who had betrayed my trust. It was about violently stripping from their hands the right and the power to ever write my history again. By Thursday morning, the suffocating pressure of my silence began to crush them. When you strip a manipulator of their ability to control the narrative, they inevitably start making fatal, sloppy mistakes. The first crack in their unified front appeared at 9:15 in the morning, arriving in the form of a highly secure, encrypted email from Delaney's newly retained legal counsel Tamara Duval. It was a formal proposition for a private, out-of-court settlement. The terms were a spectacular display of desperation masquerading as a compromise. Delaney offered to voluntarily tender her resignation, effective immediately. She agreed to quietly surrender her unvested equity in Palisade Renewal Group and walk away without requesting a severance package. In exchange, she demanded a sweeping non-disclosure agreement. Specifically, she required that I permanently bury the entire Pacific Ridge Advisory dossier and officially drop any pending civil litigation against Nolan. She wanted to sweep the ashes under the rug and disappear into the night. Mara read the terms aloud to me over a secure phone line, her voice dripping with professional disdain. I did not even need to pause to consider the offer. I instructed Mara to reject it immediately, without a counteroffer. You do not offer your enemy a quiet exit when you are winning. You only offer a settlement when you realize the impending verdict will destroy you. Delaney knew that the moment the forged metadata and the vendor kickback ledgers entered the public court record, her career in corporate America would be permanently incinerated. She was terrified of the truth, and I was absolutely done trading in secrets. Just 4 hours after the settlement offer collapsed, the second fracture appeared. My personal cellular phone buzzed with an incoming message. It was Nolan. The arrogant, triumphant tone from his late-night Hawaiian dispatch had completely evaporated. He was no longer the victorious husband holding a champagne flute. He was a drowning man desperately reaching for a life raft he had already punctured. His messages arrived in rapid, pathetic bursts. He begged me to meet him in person. Just the two of us, in a neutral public space. He pleaded for 5 minutes of my time so we could speak like a husband and wife who used to love each other. The audacity of his vocabulary was almost clinical. Then came the inevitable pivot. He started shifting the entirety of the blame onto his new bride. He typed out frantic paragraphs claiming that Delaney had manipulated him, that she had systematically brainwashed him with corporate paranoia, and that he was merely a naive pawn caught in her aggressive web of ambition. He wanted to convince me that the man who had secretly recorded my therapy reflections was actually the victim. I did not feel a single flicker of sympathy. I did not feel the agonizing pull of a broken heart. I only felt a profound, freezing disgust. I did not reply to his pleas. I took high-resolution captures of every single message and immediately forwarded the entire chain directly to Mara. By reaching out to me while we were actively preparing for litigation, Nolan had just handed us a beautiful, unforced error. Mara immediately categorized the messages as documented witness tampering and an indirect admission of guilt. He had tried to soften me up with nostalgia, but all he accomplished was adding another brick to the wall of his own legal tomb. While their personal alliance was actively imploding, Elias Trent delivered the final, devastating blow from his forensic laboratory. He called me into a secure video conference to present the fully completed financial autopsy. The initial numbers we had found were merely the tip of the iceberg. Elias had spent the last 48 hours ripping through the encrypted layers of their banking network. The final tally was staggering. Elias proved that over $2,400,000 in vendor rebates and consulting success fees had been systematically drained from our operational budget. The money had flowed directly from 3 desperate construction suppliers, through the dark accounts of Pacific Ridge Advisory, and then washed back out to fund their entire covert operation. The stolen capital had paid for the luxury condominium deposit in Maui, the lavish wedding ceremony, their aggressive public relations retainers, and the expensive legal counsel they were currently using to fight me. They had literally used my own company's revenue to finance their elaborate plot to separate me from my life's work. The mechanical precision of the theft was breathtaking. The momentum was now moving at terminal velocity. That afternoon, Tessa Van walked into a sterile, windowless conference room in Mara's office building and sat down for her formal, sworn deposition. Under the harsh fluorescent lights, with a court reporter documenting every single syllable, my former assistant delivered the most damning testimony of the entire week. Tessa sat perfectly still and recounted a specific, closed-door conversation she had overheard between Nolan and Delaney just 3 days before their flight to Hawaii. She testified, under penalty of perjury, that she heard Delaney explicitly outline the timing of the betrayal. Delaney had stated clearly that the island wedding had to happen precisely before the emergency board meeting. Tessa quoted Delaney verbatim, stating that the objective was to ensure Scarlett walks into the room bleeding out. That single phrase changed the entire complexion of the upcoming battle. It permanently destroyed any lingering defense they might have had regarding a crime of passion. Tessa's sworn statement proved absolute, premeditated malice. It confirmed that the emotional devastation of the affair was a calculated, weaponized tactic designed specifically to manipulate corporate governance. Faced with the undeniable weight of the financial ledgers, the metadata forgery, and Tessa's explosive deposition, the chairman of the board officially pulled the emergency brake. He bypassed standard protocol and invoked a rare extreme governance clause. He and the 2 largest institutional investors summoned all parties to a special closed-door session combined with an emergency arbitration hearing. It was scheduled for 9 o'clock the following morning. There would be no prolonged, agonizing months of public court battles. All the evidence regarding governance violations, ethical breaches, and financial fraud would be laid bare and judged in one single day. The evening before the hearing, I stood alone in the center of my vast, silent living room. The oppressive heat of the Atlanta day had finally broken, leaving behind a cool, sharp night air. I looked around the house I had bought with my own money, protected by my own foresight. The silence was no longer a symptom of my isolation. It was the sound of total control. I was standing precisely on the threshold of the climax. I knew exactly what awaited me the next morning. I would walk into a glass boardroom and face the two people who had smiled in my face while holding a knife to my throat. But the fear was completely gone. I was not just preparing to confront a cheating husband and a treacherous business partner. I was preparing to face down the entire, elaborate architecture of lies they had constructed to erase me from my own legacy. They had spent months digging a grave with my name on it, but tomorrow morning, I was going to force them to lie in it. The emergency arbitration convened precisely at 9 o'clock in the morning inside a massive, climate-controlled glass boardroom in the heart of downtown Atlanta. The space was sterile, heavily air-conditioned, and completely devoid of warmth, serving as the perfect arena for a corporate execution. I sat at the far end of the long mahogany table, flanked by Mara Duval and Elias Trent. When the heavy glass doors swung open, Delaney walked in first. She wore a sharp, navy blue designer suit, attempting to project the formidable, untouchable aura of a chief executive officer who was merely dealing with a minor administrative misunderstanding. Her chin was held high, but the stiff, mechanical way she pulled out her leather chair betrayed her absolute panic. Nolan trailed in right behind her. The effortlessly magnetic, golden retriever charm that had successfully navigated him through his entire adult life had completely evaporated. He looked physically diminished, his shoulders slumped, his eyes darting nervously around the room, avoiding my gaze at all costs. He looked like a man who had finally realized he was standing on the wrong side of a very high cliff. The chairman of the board, sitting at the head of the table, did not offer them coffee or pleasantries. He simply nodded to my legal counsel. Mara Duval stood up. She did not open her binder with a dramatic speech about shattered vows or the sanctity of marriage. She bypassed the emotional infidelity entirely. Mara opened the tribunal strictly with the uncompromising language of corporate law. She outlined a devastating, airtight case of severe fiduciary breach, the intentional concealment of third-party intermediary suppliers, and a highly coordinated conspiracy to fraudulently alter executive governance. She yielded the floor to Elias Trent. Elias projected his financial flowcharts onto the massive digital display covering the entire back wall of the boardroom. In brutal, undeniable detail, he traced the illicit capital. He showed the board exactly how hundreds of thousands of dollars had been quietly siphoned away from our municipal supply chain and funneled directly into the black box of Pacific Ridge Advisory. Then, he reversed the flow, showing that very same money pouring out to fund the luxury beachfront condominium deposit in Maui, their first-class airline tickets, and the aggressive public relations retainers they were currently using to smear my name. He proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that they had financed their corporate coup using stolen public infrastructure funds. Delaney opened her mouth to object, her face flushing a deep, angry crimson, but Mara cut her off by projecting the next piece of evidence. It was the metadata timeline, perfectly aligned with Tessa's sworn deposition regarding the backdated compliance forms. Mara walked the board through the exact chronology of the forgery. She pointed to the screen, showing that the digital timestamps on the newly created ethics disclosures occurred exactly 3 hours after the infamous wedding photograph had been transmitted to my mobile phone. Delaney had not filed those papers months in advance, as she claimed. She had frantically fabricated them in the middle of the night from a hotel business center in Hawaii, desperately trying to cover her tracks after realizing the board was freezing her authority. Then came the fatal blow. Mara pressed a button on her remote, and the screen transitioned to the title slide of the presentation recovered from Tessa's mirrored drive. The words "phase shift" loomed over the room in bold, black letters. Step by step, Mara walked the silent, horrified board members through the anatomy of the assassination plot. She read Delaney and Nolan's own bullet points aloud. The presentation detailed the exact strategy to weaponize the island wedding to induce severe emotional shock, launch a coordinated media narrative framing me as mentally unstable, trigger an emergency board vote, and successfully seize the chief executive seat within 48 hours. It was not a romance. It was a hostile, premeditated takeover relying entirely on the psychological destruction of the founder. Nolan suddenly cracked. The suffocating pressure of the room shattered his composure. He practically leaped out of his chair, his hands waving frantically, his voice cracking as he pointed a trembling finger directly at his new wife. He blurted out that he had nothing to do with the financial mechanics, that he was simply a creative director, and that Delaney had manipulated him into the entire scheme. He tried to throw the woman he had just married straight under the wheels of the bus to save his own skin. Mara did not raise her voice. She simply clicked to the final slide. It was a massive, high-resolution screenshot of a private text message sent from Nolan's phone to Delaney's just days before their flight. The text read clearly for everyone in the room to see. "Do not worry about the blast radius. She is too proud to scream in public, so she will just break beautifully, and we will walk right in." The silence that followed was absolute and freezing. The older, conservative men on the board stared at Nolan with an unmasked, visceral disgust. Nolan sank back into his leather chair, burying his face in his hands, finally realizing there was no charm or manipulation left in the world that could save him from his own written words. The chairman did not even require a private recess to deliberate. The vote was called right there at the table. It was unanimous. Delaney Cross was officially terminated for cause, effective immediately. The board completely stripped her of all unvested equity, permanently revoked her signing authority, and formally banned her from the premises. In the very next breath, the board issued a unanimous resolution authorizing me, as the chief executive officer, to unleash the full weight of the company's legal department to file devastating civil suits against both Nolan and Delaney for corporate collusion, systemic fraud, and the unauthorized access of proprietary data. Before the meeting adjourned, I delivered my own piece of news. I informed the board that I had personally spent the early hours of the morning on the phone with the procurement officers of our 3 largest suspended clients. After I had transparently shared the implementation of our new, aggressive independent audit mechanisms, all 3 clients had officially agreed to resume their multi-million-dollar contracts. The very scandal Nolan and Delaney had engineered to kill my company had instead become the ultimate proof of its indestructible foundation. The fortress remained standing, completely unbothered by their absence. By noon, it was entirely over. Nolan walked out of that building with nothing. He was permanently locked out of his home. His lucrative consulting contracts were completely severed, and his professional reputation in the media industry was reduced to radioactive ash. Delaney lost the company she had desperately tried to steal, her prestigious executive title, her entire financial future, and she was now staring down the barrel of years of grueling, bankrupting financial litigation. I remained sitting at the head of the long mahogany table long after the lawyers, the board members, and the 2 traders had cleared out. The massive glass doors clicked shut, leaving me completely alone in the sprawling, quiet boardroom. The bright afternoon sun filtered through the high windows. I looked up at the massive digital display monitor on the wall, now turned completely black. In the dark reflection of the screen, I saw my own face. I did not look broken. I did not look like a woman who had been defeated. I looked exactly like the person I had always been. A woman who survives the storm and rebuilds. A profound, almost weightless sense of liberation washed over me. I finally understood the brutal poetry of it all. They had sent that text message from Maui in the middle of the night to make me feel small, discarded, and pathetic. But what they had actually delivered to me, wrapped in floral leis and champagne, was the exact, perfect timestamp I needed to lock the door on them forever. Thank you so much for listening to my story today. I would love to know where you are listening from, so please drop a comment below so we can interact and share our thoughts together. If you enjoyed this journey, please subscribe to Violet Revenge Stories, hit the like button on this video, and support the channel even more by pressing the hype button so this story can be heard by many more people.